The day Donald Trump made a homeless veteran cry wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't tears of anger or humiliation. It was something far more profound, something that would change how everyone in that Manhattan cafe viewed both men forever. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe in downtown Manhattan, a stark contrast to the bitter December wind outside. Trump sat quietly at a corner table, his signature red tie loosened slightly, almost blending in with the morning crowd. For once, he wasn't surrounded by security or cameras, just a man seeking a moment of peace with his morning coffee. The cafe buzzed with the usual morning symphony, the hiss of espresso machines, gentle murmurs of conversation, and the soft tapping of laptops. Most patrons were too absorbed in their own worlds to notice the former president, and those who did maintained a respectful distance. But peace, as Trump had learned throughout his life, was often fleeting. The door burst open, letting in a gust of cold air and a man whose presence immediately commanded attention. He stood in the doorway, his military jacket worn and faded, patches barely clinging to the fabric. His face was weathered, eyes sharp with an intensity that spoke of battles fought both abroad and at home. The veteran's gaze locked onto Trump, and the cafe fell silent. The comfortable morning ambiance evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick you could almost taste it. "You," the veteran's voice cracked through the silence, "you sit there, drinking your fancy coffee, while men like me sleep on the streets." Heads turned. Phones emerged, ready to capture whatever drama might unfold. A barista froze mid-pour, uncertain whether to call security. Trump remained still, his expression unreadable as the veteran approached his table. Years of public scrutiny had taught him to maintain composure, but something about this man's eyes, the pain, the anger, the desperation, struck a chord he wasn't expecting. The veteran planted his hands on Trump's table, leaning forward. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Do you even know what it's like to lose everything? To fight for your country and come home to nothing?" The other patrons watched, breaths held, waiting for Trump's reaction. Would he call for security? Dismiss the man? Stand his ground? But what Trump did next wouldn't just diffuse a tense situation. It would reveal a family secret that had been buried for decades. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Some patrons had their phones ready, expecting another viral moment of conflict. But they were about to witness something entirely different. Trump's expression shifted, not to anger or dismissal, but to something softer, almost familiar. He looked at the veteran's hands, still planted firmly on the table, and noticed the slight tremor in them. The faded patches on his jacket told stories of service that deserved more than a hasty dismissal. "Please," Trump said quietly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, "sit down and have coffee with me." The veteran's face flickered with confusion, his rage momentarily derailed by the unexpected invitation. "What kind of game are you playing?" he demanded, though the edge in his voice had dulled slightly. "No game," Trump replied, his voice steady. "You asked if I know what it's like to lose everything. Maybe I don't, not the way you do, but I'd like to understand." The cafe patrons exchanged glances. This wasn't the Trump they were used to seeing on television. There was no bravado, no defensive posturing. Instead, there was something else, a gentleness that seemed to catch even the veteran off guard. "You want to understand?" the veteran scoffed, but he was wavering. His white-knuckled grip on the table had loosened. "You can't possibly—" "Try me," Trump interrupted softly. He caught the eye of a nearby waitress. "Could we get another coffee here, and maybe something to eat?" The veteran stood frozen, caught between his original fury and this unexpected turn of events. The other customers watched as something shifted in his eyes, a battle between pride and desperation, between anger and a deeper need to be heard. A young woman in business attire at the next table discreetly lowered her phone, suddenly ashamed of her eagerness to capture conflict. An elderly man by the window nodded slightly, as if approving of Trump's approach. The barista, who had been ready to call security, slowly moved her hand away from the phone. "I don't need your charity," the veteran said, but his voice had lost its earlier venom. Instead, it carried the weight of exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting battles for too long. "It's not charity," Trump replied, maintaining eye contact. "It's respect, for your service, for your sacrifice, and maybe—" He paused, something flickering across his face. "Maybe it's about making good on an old promise." The veteran's brow furrowed at those last words. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he pulled out the chair. As he sank into it, his military jacket fell open slightly, revealing a medal that made Trump's eyes widen with recognition. It was identical to one he'd seen before, decades ago, in a memory that would soon change everything about this encounter. The waitress appeared with coffee and a plate of breakfast pastries, setting them down quietly. The veteran stared at the food, his hands now resting on his lap, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of his anger had been replaced by something heavier. "You know what the worst part is?" he finally said, his voice low and raw with emotion. "This isn't even about the money or the struggles. It's about being forgotten, and you, your family, you promised you'd never forget people like me." Trump's face paled slightly, and for the first time that morning his composure cracked. Those words had struck a chord deeper than anyone in the cafe could have guessed. He leaned forward, studying the medal more carefully now. "That medal," Trump said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vietnam?" The veteran nodded stiffly. 71, just outside of Saigon. Trump's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "My father." He started, then stopped, as if weighing his next words carefully. He used to talk about a soldier he met back then, someone who changed how he saw everything. The cafe had grown so quiet that even the hiss of the espresso machine seemed intrusive. Other customers found themselves holding their breath, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary unfolding. "What was his name?" the veteran asked, a strange note creeping into his voice. Trump's answer was about to reveal a connection that would stun everyone in that cafe, a story of promises, redemption, and a debt that spanned generations. Trump's fingers drummed lightly against his coffee cup, his eyes fixed on the medal. "The soldier my father met, his name was James Connor. Dad never forgot him because of what happened that night in Queens." The veteran's hands began to shake so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim of his cup. "How do you—" His voice trailed off, color draining from his face. "It was raining," Trump continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Dad was leaving his office late, and there was this young soldier, soaked to the bone, sitting on the steps of an old diner. He was still in his uniform, just back from Vietnam." The cafe had fallen into an almost reverent silence. Even the staff had stopped their work, drawn into the unfolding story. "Your father," the veteran said, his voice barely audible. "He bought me coffee that night. Said a soldier shouldn't be sitting alone in the rain." A woman at a nearby table pressed her hand to her mouth, realization dawning. An elderly man in the corner removed his glasses, wiping his eyes discreetly. "He did more than that," Trump said softly. "He gave you a job, found you an apartment, said it was the least he could do for someone who'd served his country." The veteran, James Connor, stared at Trump, decades of anger seemingly melting away, replaced by something more complex. "Your father saved my life that night. I was thinking of ending it all. Everything felt so hopeless." Trump nodded, emotion flickering across his face. "Dad used to tell us that story every Thanksgiving, about the soldier who taught him that success meant nothing if you couldn't use it to help others. But then," James's voice hardened slightly, "you all forgot. The world moved on, and men like me were left behind again." "No," Trump said, leaning forward. "We didn't forget. That night changed how our family saw everything. It's why we—" He paused, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his phone. With a few quick taps, he pulled up a web page and turned it toward James. What James saw on that screen would shake him to his core and reveal a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. On the screen was a web page for the Veterans Bridge Foundation, its logo prominently featuring a soldier standing in the rain. James's eyes widened as he scanned the text. Established 1971 by Fred Trump in honor of James Connor. "Dad never forgot you, James," Trump said quietly. "He started this foundation the day after he met you. Over 50 years, it's helped thousands of veterans find homes, jobs, purpose. But he kept your name out of the headlines because he said real charity doesn't need attention." James's hands trembled as he stared at the screen, at the foundation he'd never known existed. Other patrons in the cafe leaned forward, some wiping tears, others holding their phones forgotten in their laps. "All these years," James whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been so angry, thinking no one cared, that your family just—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Every veteran who comes through those doors," Trump continued, scrolling through photos of housing projects, job training centers, and rehabilitation facilities, "they're helped because of that night, because you showed my father what courage really looks like." A young barista quietly placed fresh cups of coffee on their table, her own eyes glistening. The morning sun had broken through the clouds outside, casting a warm glow across the cafe. "But why didn't he ever tell me?" James asked, looking up from the phone. Trump's expression softened. "He tried. For years, he tried to find you, but you'd disappeared, changed cities, lost touch. He never stopped looking, though, and when he passed away, his last request was that we keep looking." James sat back in his chair, decades of bitterness visibly lifting from his shoulders. "I moved around a lot," he admitted. "Couldn't stay in one place. The memories." He gestured vaguely at his worn jacket. "Sometimes it's easier to be angry than to face your own ghosts." An elderly woman at the next table suddenly spoke up, her voice gentle. "My Harold was in Vietnam too," she said. "This foundation, they helped him when he came home. We never knew where the help came from. We just knew someone cared." Other voices began to join in, a quiet chorus of similar stories. The cafe had transformed from a place of tension to one of shared connection, as people began to realize how many lives had been touched by a single act of kindness on a rainy night in Queens. But what happened next would turn this moment of reconciliation into something even more extraordinary. Trump pulled out a worn business card from his wallet, its edges softened with age. "Dad carried this with him for years," he said, sliding it across the table. "Your service number." He said he'd never stop looking. James picked up the card with unsteady fingers. The numbers were faded, but still legible. His past preserved in his old commanding officer's handwriting. A past he'd tried so hard to forget. "Every Veterans Day," Trump continued, "Dad would try running these numbers again, checking databases, calling contacts. Even when he got sick, he'd say, 'Did we find James yet?'" The cafe had grown so quiet you could hear the gentle ticking of the wall clock. A teenage boy who had been scrolling on his phone now sat transfixed, his device forgotten in his lap. "I was there that night too, you know," Trump said softly. "I was just a kid, waiting in the car while Dad worked late. I watched him walk up to you in the rain. It was the first time I saw him cry." James looked up sharply. "What?" When he came back to the car, he was crying. He said, "Donald, I just met a real hero and he's sitting in the rain because we failed him. That changed everything for our family." A middle-aged man in a business suit at the counter cleared his throat. "The foundation. They helped my brother last year. Got him off the streets into rehab. We didn't know where the help came from either." "That's how Dad wanted it," Trump replied, not taking his eyes off James. He said, "True help doesn't need recognition, but he did want one thing." He reached into his jacket again, pulling out an envelope that looked weathered despite its obvious care. James stared at the envelope, his coffee now cold and forgotten. "What is this?" "Dad wrote this letter before he died. Asked me to deliver it if we ever found you. For 20 years, I've carried it, hoping I'd have the chance." The veteran's hands shook as he reached for the envelope. The cafe seemed to collectively hold its breath as he carefully opened it, unfolding the paper inside. As he began to read, tears filled his eyes. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. "My dear friend James," he read aloud, his voice trembling. "If you're reading this, I've finally found you, though perhaps too late. That night in the rain, you taught me what real courage looks like. Not the kind that wins medals, though you earned those too, but the kind that keeps going when everything seems hopeless." James had to stop, emotion overwhelming him. A young woman nearby quietly offered him a tissue, which he accepted with a grateful nod. Trump sat quietly, allowing James the moment he needed. Around them, the cafe patrons watched in respectful silence, many wiping their own tears. Finally, James continued reading. "You showed me that success means nothing if we don't use it to lift others up. Every veteran we've helped since that night, and there have been thousands, they owe their second chance to you. You may have thought you were forgotten, but your legacy lives on in every life we've touched. I never forgot my promise to you, James. I never will. With eternal gratitude. Fred." The paper shook in James's hands as he lowered it. The hardened exterior he'd worn like armor for so many years had cracked completely, revealing the wounded soldier who'd sat in the rain so many years ago. "All this time," he whispered, "I thought no one cared. I thought I was just another forgotten soldier." Trump leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You were never forgotten, James. You were the reason we kept going, and now that we've found you, there's something else Dad wanted you to know." I'll continue with the core development section, building toward the climactic revelation. "There's a position waiting for you," Trump said, pulling another document from his jacket. "Has been for 50 years. Dad made sure of it. Head of Veteran Outreach at the Foundation. He always said no one could understand our veterans better than you." James stared at the document, his weathered hands hovering over it uncertainly. I don't know what to say. After how I acted, coming in here like that, like a soldier fighting one last battle." Trump's voice carried no judgment. "Sometimes the hardest wars are the ones we fight with ourselves." An older gentleman in military dress at a nearby table stood up slowly. "Sir," he addressed James, "I run the VA Center downtown. We've worked with the Veterans Bridge Foundation for years. Never knew the story behind it, but I've seen the lives it's changed." Others in the cafe began sharing their connections. A cousin helped by the foundation, a neighbor who found purpose through its programs, a friend who'd turned their life around. Each story seemed to lift a weight from James's shoulders, replacing decades of anger with something like wonder. "Your father," James said, turning back to Trump, "he saw something in me that night that I'd forgotten was there. Hope, maybe. Purpose." He fingered the medal on his jacket. "But I lost that again somewhere along the way." Trump reached into his pocket one final time. "Dad thought you might say that. That's why he left you this too." He placed a small box on the table between them. The cafe grew silent once more as James opened it. Inside lay a medal identical to the one he wore, but this one was newer, gleaming under the cafe lights. "It's the same as yours," Trump explained. "Dad had it made after that night. Said it reminded him that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is ask for help." James lifted the medal with trembling fingers. Engraved on the back were words that would change everything. "To James Connor, the man who taught us the true meaning of service. Your battle isn't over, but you don't fight alone." The veteran's tough exterior finally cracked completely. Tears rolled down his cheeks as 50 years of pain, anger, and loneliness began to wash away. But these weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of finding something long thought lost. "I've been so angry for so long," James said, his voice barely a whisper, fighting enemies that weren't even there, and all this time. Trump reached across the table, placing a hand on the older man's shoulder. All this time, you were still serving, James. Every veteran helped by the Foundation. That's your legacy. You just didn't know it. The morning sun had fully broken through the clouds now, streaming through the cafe windows. The light caught the two medals, old and new, past and present, creating a moment that no one present would ever forget. But what James said next would transform not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who would hear this story. James stood slowly, his bearing shifting subtly, no longer a man weighed down by bitterness, but a soldier standing at attention one more time. He picked up both medals, holding them in his open palm. "You know what these really mean?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cafe. "They're not just about what we did over there, they're about what we do when we come home." He turned to face the room, and for the first time the other patrons could see him clearly, not as an angry homeless veteran, but as a man who had carried a hidden burden for far too long. "I came in here today ready for one last fight," he continued, his voice steady now, "but instead, I found something I lost 50 years ago. Not just hope, but purpose." Trump watched quietly as James moved to the center of the cafe. The morning sun caught his medals, casting twin gleams across the room. "Mr. Trump," James said, turning back to face him, "your father didn't just help one soldier that night. Through this foundation, he created a legacy that's helped thousands. And now," he squared his shoulders, "I think it's time I helped carry that forward." A woman in scrubs stood up from her table. "My brother," she said, wiping tears, "he came back from Afghanistan last year. Couldn't readjust. The Foundation's program saved his life." "Mine too," called another voice. A young man in a business suit raised his hand. "Marine Corps, Iraq. The Foundation gave me a second chance when I needed it most." One by one, people began standing, sharing stories of how the Veterans Bridge Foundation had touched their lives, directly or through family and friends. Each testimony seemed to strengthen James's resolve. Trump rose from his chair, moving to stand beside James. "The position is yours," he said, "if you're ready to help us find more soldiers who think they've been forgotten." James looked down at the medals in his hand, then surveyed the room full of faces now watching with anticipation. "I spent 50 years fighting the wrong battle," he said. "Maybe it's time to fight the right one." The cafe erupted in applause. The barista who had nearly called security earlier was now openly crying. The businessman who'd been impatiently checking his watch all morning stood and snapped a sharp salute to James. But it was what happened next that would turn this moment into a movement. James turned to address the room one final time. "To any veteran out there who thinks they're fighting alone, you're not. I thought I was the only one struggling, but look around this room. We're all connected. We all have a story. And maybe—" He glanced at Trump, then back to the crowd. "Maybe it's time we started telling them." Trump pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and handed it to the nearest patron. "Take a picture," he said. "Not for publicity, for the Foundation's wall of hope. Every veteran should know their story matters." James and Trump stood side by side, the angry veteran and the businessman now united by a 50-year-old promise. As the photo was taken, James suddenly remembered something. "Your father," he said to Trump, "that night in the rain, he told me something I never understood until now. He said, 'Sometimes the greatest act of courage is letting someone help you fight your battles.'" The impact of those words resonated through the cafe. Phones came out, not to capture scandal or conflict, but to spread a message of hope. Within hours, the story would reach veterans across the country, sparking a chain reaction that would change countless lives. As the morning crowd began to disperse, each person left changed by what they'd witnessed. But for James and Trump, standing amid the empty coffee cups and shared tears, this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. "There's something else you should see," Trump said, guiding James to a tablet one of the cafe staff had brought over. Social media was already lighting up with their story. Veterans from across the country were sharing their own struggles, their own moments of feeling forgotten. #NeverForgotten and #VeteransPromise were trending, with thousands of posts flooding in. But it wasn't just veterans. It was their families, friends, and complete strangers pledging support. "Look at this," James said, his voice thick with emotion as he read one post. "My dad's a Vietnam vet. Never talks about it. Today, for the first time, he asked for help. Said if James Connor could do it, so could he." The cafe had become a makeshift command center. People who had come for their morning coffee were now making calls, sharing resources, connecting veterans with the foundation. The barista had put up an impromptu sign, "Veterans Coffee Free today, in honor of James Connor." A young woman approached their table, her hands clasped nervously. "My grandfather," she began. "He's like you, served in Vietnam, won't talk about it, won't get help. Would you be willing to speak with him?" James looked at the medals in his hand, then at Trump, who nodded encouragingly. "Give me his number," James said firmly. "He's not alone anymore." As James wrote down the information, Trump received a text that made him smile. "The Foundation's hotline," he explained. "They've received more calls in the last hour than they usually get in a week. Veterans reaching out, asking for help. Your story, James. It's breaking down walls." The elderly veteran who'd saluted earlier approached with a group of others. "We've been talking," he said, gesturing to those behind him. "We want to start a mentorship program, veterans helping veterans. Would the Foundation support something like that?" "It would be our honor," Trump replied, but he looked to James. "What do you think? Head of Veteran Outreach?" James straightened his jacket, a new purpose evident in his bearing. "When do we start?" The momentum was building. What had begun as an angry confrontation was transforming into a movement of hope and healing. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. A young soldier in uniform, who had been quietly watching from the corner, finally stood up. His hands were shaking as he addressed the room. "I've been sitting here for 2 hours," he admitted, his voice barely steady. "Was working up the courage to—" He paused, taking a deep breath. "I just got back from Afghanistan. Haven't slept properly in months. Was thinking maybe it would be better if—" He couldn't finish, but he didn't need to. James was already moving toward him with the speed and purpose of a man who recognized the pain in another soldier's eyes. What happened next would prove that sometimes the greatest battles we fight are the ones that bring us together. James reached the young soldier in 3 long strides, pulling him into an embrace that spoke volumes. Not just veteran to veteran, but warrior to warrior, survivor to survivor. Trump stood quietly, watching as 50 years of pain transformed into purpose. "Son," James said, his voice firm but gentle, "I know that darkness. I lived in it for decades. But look around this room. Look at all these people. This is what hope looks like." The young soldier's shoulders shook as he finally let go, releasing emotions he'd held in check for too long. Others in the cafe moved closer, forming a circle of support. Not just observers anymore, but participants in something profound. Trump pulled out his phone one more time, but not for a photo. "The Foundation's Trauma Center," he said, holding it out. "They're expecting your call. And James here, he'll make sure you're not walking this path alone." The cafe had transformed from a simple coffee shop into something sacred. The morning rush had given way to lingering conversations, shared stories, and exchanged contact information. Veterans who had entered as strangers were leaving as brothers, their isolation broken by a chance encounter that had sparked a chain reaction of compassion. "You know what my father would say about all this?" Trump mused, watching the scene unfold. He'd say, "Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest challenges." James nodded, one hand still on the young soldier's shoulder. "And sometimes," he added, "it takes hitting rock bottom to realize how many hands are reaching down to help you up." The story spread far beyond that cafe's walls. By evening, news outlets were running features about the Veterans Bridge Foundation. Social media buzzed with similar stories of veterans finding hope, reaching out, breaking their silence. Never Forgotten had become more than a hashtag. It was becoming a movement. But perhaps the most powerful change was the one that couldn't be captured in headlines or viral videos. It was in the way James stood straighter, his eyes clear and purposeful. It was in the young soldier's relieved smile as he made his first appointment for help. It was in the quiet nods of recognition between veterans who no longer felt invisible. As the day drew to a close, James prepared to leave, not for the streets, but for the Foundation's transitional housing. Before he left, he turned to Trump one last time. "Tell me something," he said. "That second medal, your father had it made right after he met me?" Trump nodded. He said every soldier deserves a reminder that their service doesn't end when the war does, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let others fight alongside us. James touched both medals, now pinned proudly on his jacket. "Well," he said with a slight smile, "looks like I've got a new mission." The cafe staff had begun their closing routine, but no one seemed eager to break the spell of what they'd witnessed. As James walked out, standing tall despite his years, his voice carried back one last time. "Remember, soldiers, you're never fighting alone." If this story touched your heart, remember that every day veterans are fighting battles we can't see. Sometimes all it takes is a moment of kindness, a willing ear, or an outstretched hand to change a life. Share this story, but more importantly, share your compassion. Because in the end, we're all in this fight together.